Bryan Fischer here with D1 Ticker. Happy to be joined now by Matt Fortuna of The Athletic for another edition of D1 Extra AD Search Insights. And Matt, we're talking Penn State. Sandy Barbour announced her retirement. And I guess my first question for you is just, were you a little bit surprised at the timing of this announcement?
Bryan, thanks for having me. Big fan, been watching all of your clips. I'm honored to join you. Not terribly surprised. I just think you're seeing more and more ADs who've put in the time, who put in 20 plus years of work, like Sandy Barbour has, eventually decide they don't want to do this anymore, or that the game is the transfer portal. I don't mean to sound like a dinosaur myself here, reciting all the changes that have come to college athletics the last couple of years. But every AD you talk to, both young and old, talks about how different this business is from the business they initially entered. And so anytime you see a Sandy Barbour, a Barry Alvarez, any of those big names who have been around for a while decide to step down at this point in 2022, that's almost the expectation at this point, because there's been so much turnover at so many of the big time AD jobs across the country.
I mean, Sandy's on the D1 Council. She's the football oversight chair. She's been on a lot of Big Ten committees, especially kind of getting the Big Ten, football and other sports back during COVID. Do you think fatigue? I don't want to label it that and necessarily put it on there, but do you think that fatigue certainly was a driving factor in announcing this now?
Yeah, that's a good question, Bryan. I don't want to speak for Sandy or any other AD who decides to make a career choice like that, but it's different. I mean, it's different. I mean, you look at some of the recent AD hires across the country. Graham Neff at Clemson, 38 years old. Brian Blair at Toledo, 37 years old. I don't want to say it's a young man's game, because certainly there are a lot of seasoned vets, both male and female, who are doing a great job in this business. But it's very, very different from what it was 5 years ago, let alone 10, 20, 30 years ago, when some of these ADs first got into the business. So we keep hearing about change coming. We're seeing change come in real life. We'll see what happens with the constitutional committee that the NCAA is devised. I mean, these things tend to move at a glacial pace, but there certainly are movements happening to start that change, which is more than can be said in the past. So I'll be curious to see how all this plays out, especially when we get down the road to college football playoff expansion. And will there be some kind of guardrails with NIL or anything of the like? I don't know. I'll believe all that when I see it. But I just think with so much change happening at the NCAA level and on the institution level, you're seeing a lot of presidential turnover as well. And that was the case with Penn State as well, hiring Louisville's president, Nita Budapente. So anytime there's change, I mean, I think that makes everyone vulnerable in their positions.
She's got certainly an interesting tenure. I know she has a unique relationship with Penn State and that fan base. But when you do reflect on her tenure, obviously you have James Franklin's recent extension. She hired a new men's basketball coach recently. There's been a ton of hockey and wrestling success. How do you kind of reflect on her tenure so far there in State College?
I think it was pretty good. I mean, I think when you look at what she entered, it was January 2014 or right around then. It was shortly after James Franklin was hired, maybe the summer of 2014. And I mean, that place was still pretty scarred from probably the greatest scandal in higher education history. They were only 3 years removed from that. I mean, there was, not to make this solely about athletics, but there was a big belief, and I'm a Penn State graduate. I did not see a path forward for them competing at a high level on the football field anytime soon. And, James Franklin, Sandy Barbour, that entire regime, completely dismissed that notion and won big pretty early on, and not just at football. I mean, if you look at Penn State, that's 31 varsity sports, and they're pretty darn good at all of them. I know men's basketball isn't exactly a Big Ten power, but you know what? They went out and got a pretty darn good coach in Micah Shrewsbury, who had an impressive first year at a place that's very difficult to win. So it's hard not to look back at Sandy Barbour's tenure at Penn State and deem it a success.
You mentioned earlier that there is a new president coming in Neely Biddapudi from Louisville. She's replacing Eric Barron. I'm curious to kind of get your thoughts. It does seem like there's a bit of a clean break in terms of bringing in a new president, obviously going to hire a new AD. What have you heard in terms of this transition and really ultimately what the new president might be looking for?
Yeah, Bryan, that's a good question. I mean, I think all we can go off is their resume, right? Their past. And what we saw at Louisville was not the cleanest of breaks between the president and the AD, Vince Tyra, who ended up leaving toward the end of last football season. What's that mean? for how Penn State's AD search is going to unfold, that remains to be seen. I'll be curious to see what kind of role, if any, James Franklin plays in this. I mean, the guy was just signed to a 10-year contract extension, and I doubt he's committing to Penn State that long himself. And obviously, he's getting a nice chunk of change out of it, but I doubt he's making that commitment himself if he's not going to have a bigger role and a bigger voice in things. Is he going to be in on this process with picking out who essentially will be his new boss? I mean, Paul Chryst was on Wisconsin's committee when they ended up replacing Barry Alvarez and promoting Chris McIntosh from within last summer. I'll be curious what kind of role, if any, James Franklin has in picking Sandy Barbour's replacement.
You do know the place well. What is kind of on that to-do list, and does it start and end kind of with Beaver Stadium and renovating that place?
Yeah, I think that's priority number 1, 2, and 3 right now. I mean, it's a landmark. It's one of the biggest stadiums in America. It's an awesome game day environment, but I mean, I've covered a lot of games there. I'm sure you've covered a lot of games there. It's pretty dated. I mean, structurally, that thing needs a makeover. And not only does it need a makeover, I think you're seeing more and more big-time college football schools figure out better ways to utilize such a large structure on their campus for more than just 6 or 7 days a year. I mean, I've covered Notre Dame pretty closely. I'm in Chicago. I look at what Jack Swarbrick did with Notre Dame, which was essentially a legacy project for him, the Campus Crossroads project. I mean, it was $400 million. That's a nice chunk of change, but what they did was take one of the most iconic venues in all of sports and turn it into essentially a 365-day-a-year building to be used for classrooms, for presentations, for student dining, for student media. There's a huge media component to Notre Dame Stadium right now that did not exist before. To say nothing of how much better the game day experience and environment is for the fan attending every Saturday. So is something like that in the cards for Penn State? I'm not so sure. That stadium is not located right in the middle, in the heart of campus, the way Notre Dame's is, nor is Penn State's campus all that similar to Notre Dame's. It's much, much bigger. But I do think you need to start thinking outside of the box and figure out the way to best utilize your most valuable asset for more than just 7 days a year.
We've seen a number of turnover in the Big Ten athletic director ranks, and if there's a type of hiring, it does seem like the Big Ten does have one. Either a former player, a former football player in particular, an internal hire. What kind of is Penn State looking for, and are any names kind of fitting those criteria?
Well, I brought up James Franklin before because I'd have to think he's at least going to have some voice at the table here, and if that's the case, you're probably going to want someone who's very well versed in big time football or who has played football. And two guys fit that mold to me more than anyone else, at least among the names we've all been talking about in the week or so since this job is open. That's Patrick Kraft from Boston College and Sean Frazier from Northern Illinois. Both guys played football. Pat Kraft was a walk-on at Indiana in the Big Ten. He has 3 degrees from the school. He completely revitalized Temple's athletic department. He even helped Loyola position itself for the Missouri Valley Conference back when they were in the Horizon League when he was a senior associate AD at Loyola Chicago. And he's done great work in a short period of time under very tough circumstances amid a pandemic at Boston College. So I look at him as an ideal fit, obviously familiar with the landscape in Pennsylvania as well, having spent some time at Temple. And Sean Frazier, very similar. I mean, how many guys can say they grew up in New York, played football in Alabama, and have spent the last decade of their career in DeKalb, Illinois? The guy's got a very well-rounded background. He's made some outstanding hires at a number of different sports at NIU. He's been a finalist for some other pretty big jobs here, and I think he's very well thought of, both in the athletic and academic realm. And, when he was at Wisconsin, serving as Barry Alvarez's right-hand man, he was very instrumental behind the scenes in helping the Big Ten get ready to have a hockey conference, which obviously came to fruition once Penn State decided to commit and build a facility and launch Division I men's and women's hockey programs. So hockey can't be overlooked at Penn State either. I like to make the joke, and I don't say this at the sake of men's basketball, but at Penn State, in some ways, men's basketball is the third most important winter sport there behind wrestling, where they've won 9 of the last 11 national championships, including one last week. And hockey. Pennsylvania is just a hockey hotbed right now. And so, football is what draws the most eyeballs. Football will probably determine who gets this job. But there are a lot of good things happening at Penn State and all the other sports as well, and I don't think that can be overlooked.
kind of timeline are we looking for? I know Sandy Barbour said she would stay on, until a new hire is kind of in the job and certainly comfortable with things. But she mentioned she's going to stay on for another year in State College there. But what kind of timeline necessarily is the school looking for to hire it? And how much is that kind of just dictated by the fact that there is a new president coming in?
That's a good question, Brian. I mean, every call I made in the week since this job is open, there's not a whole lot of movement happening right now, or if there is, no one knows about it. At least some of the people who think they would be candidates. So turnkey ZRG obviously has the search. There's a new president there who will obviously want her fingerprints on this as well. I don't think there's a rush just because Sandy Barbour is there right now. Like, she didn't get fired. Like, they don't need a replacement right now. Football season is a long ways off, at least relatively speaking, within the calendar. So I think they can take their time. I think they'll have a deliberate, thorough search to get the right person in that job. The one thing you don't want to do is I saw this last year being in Chicago with Northwestern. They had too many cooks in the kitchen, and I just thought there were too many differentiating opinions, and not everyone was getting behind one candidate or the other. And when the president decided to appoint the candidate he saw best fit, you saw some internal backlash that ultimately resulted in not only the AD, Mike Polisky, having to leave, but Morty Shapiro, the president, essentially accelerating his retirement plan. So I think you have to be very thorough here, and I think you need to keep things pretty close to the vest, because if you have too many people in that room, the more and more I hear about these things, I'm surprised anything gets done when you have 12 to 20 people in a boardroom and each one of those thinks they're the smartest person in that room. So you need to build a consensus, and you need to stand behind your man or woman once you decide that that's who's going to be your next athletic director.
Yeah, well, it is interesting that you bring that up, because as we all know, covering Penn State, the trustees there certainly do have an influence and are at least very vocal. Especially some of the former members that did play football there. Ultimately, who might be included in that decision making process, if you will, and does this have a chance to maybe get off the rails a little bit, because there are so many diverging opinions on the future of Penn State athletics?
I would hope not, but it really depends on how the new president is going to act. I mean, she just got there, and this is a very important hire, a hire that, I mean, she's made before at Louisville, but has not made before at Penn State, which is two completely different constituencies. So I think the way she acts is going to dictate how this search acts. And again, James Franklin just got locked up for 10 years, $80 million. I mean, that was kind of, when you look at the timeline, that was Sandy Barbour's kind of last major act as Penn State's athletic director. And I know there were a lot of differing opinions on whether James Franklin deserved that deal based on the last 2 seasons of play in Big Ten play, which I can understand. But I think the overall body of work speaks for itself there and positions Penn State pretty favorably going forward in the Big Ten. And I think they've got a lot of good things going for them. I think, despite there being an 80 hole there right now, there is pretty good alignment moving forward. And that's the most important thing. And I think you need to find someone who's going to come in and be a visionary, because again, this is a very fluid time in college athletics with the portal, with NIL, with the need to upgrade Beaver Stadium, with the need to I wouldn't say need, James Franklin would say need to upgrade some of the football facilities internally. But I just think everyone needs to be on the same page here, because like you said, we've seen this place at its worst, unfortunately, just over a decade ago, and it wasn't a pretty scene. So I think it's in everyone's best interest right now to come up with a plan, identify the person who fits the criteria that would be the best athletic director, and go about and get their man or woman.
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously an interesting job. That the Big Ten AD positions do not come open all that often. But how attractive would you say that this gig is now, especially after the work that Sandy has done the last 8+ years on the job, kind of repairing that reputation and certainly getting the athletic department in a much better shape, not just publicly in terms of reputation, but I think behind the scenes as well.
Yeah, I think it's a very attractive job, Brian. I think Big Ten AD jobs in particular, maybe more attractive than most, just because you're dealing with, outside of Northwestern, big state institutions that are just every single person in that state. And I didn't really appreciate this until I went to Penn State as a student who wasn't from Pennsylvania, just how the entire state rallies around that place, how the entire state has an opinion of that place, good or bad. I just think the Big Ten, you're looking at a broader spectrum of sports. 31 sports at Penn State. That is not the reality at most schools across the country. Only a handful of Big Ten and Pac-12 schools can really compete with that in terms of numbers. And not only that, they're one of the few self-sustaining athletic departments in the country on top of that. So when you put all that together, when you look at the game day environment, when you look at how Happy Valley swells to the third biggest city in the state of Pennsylvania on a home football Saturday, I think you see the power of that place. And I think that makes this a very attractive job, especially when, as you mentioned, you're going to be one of 14 athletic directors at the table with Kevin Warren in Big Ten meetings. And there is a lot of juice that comes with that position. And I don't think that's overlooked by anyone in the Big Ten.
Well, it'll be fascinating to follow along the search in State College there. Thanks for joining us, Matt.
Thanks, Bryan.
Awesome.